On the 26th of December 1900, the relief steamer Hesperus cut through the gray swells of the North Atlantic toward the Flannan Isles. For days, the lighthouse on Alien Moor had been dark, an unthinkable failure in the rigorous world of the Northern Lighthouse Board. When the relief keeper, Joseph Moore, stepped onto the landing, he found a silence so profound, it felt heavy. No signal flag was flying, no welcoming committee stood on the quay. Moore climbed the steep stairs to the gallery and found the door unlocked, and inside, the clock had stopped. 3 men had simply vanished into the salt air. But what did he really find inside those stone walls? Let's stay with what's certain about the men themselves. These weren't inexperienced sailors prone to panic. James Ducat was the principal keeper, a veteran with 21 years of service. Under him were Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur. These were men of routine, men who understood that on a rock 20 miles from the nearest shore, discipline is the only thing that keeps you alive. The lighthouse was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, a sanctuary of brass, oil, and stone. What's usually overlooked here is that the interior of the lighthouse was found in what Moore described as a proper state. The lamps were cleaned, the oil fountains were full. It looked as if the men had been interrupted in the middle of a mundane Tuesday afternoon. But the evidence suggests something broke that routine. One set of oilskins, the heavy waterproof coats essential for the brutal Scottish winter, remained on its peg. This means one of the men likely left the shelter of the lighthouse in his shirt sleeves, in the middle of a storm. Why would a professional do that? If you've heard this story before, you've likely heard about the half-eaten meal left on the table, the chair knocked over in a hurry. It's a haunting image. However, according to the official report by Superintendent Robert Muirhead, it's almost certainly a fabrication. Moore's actual testimony states that the kitchen was tidy. The table wasn't set for a meal. This is where it gets interesting because the true mystery doesn't need ghost stories to be terrifying. The real anomalies were much more subtle. A set of fire irons had been cleaned and polished. The pots were washed. The keepers had followed their duties right up until the moment they ceased to exist. We often prefer the sensational version of history because it offers a clear moment of terror. But the reality is more unsettling. It suggests a disappearance that was quiet, or perhaps so sudden that it left no trace of a struggle. But if there was no struggle inside, we have to look outside, at the cliffs of the West Landing. And then we have to ask, what could possibly bend solid iron? The most famous and controversial evidence in this case are the logbook entries from December 14th and 15th. These entries describe a storm of such ferocity that Thomas Marshall allegedly wrote that James Ducat was very quiet and the third man, MacArthur, was crying. The final entry supposedly read, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." It's a perfect dramatic arc, but there's a problem. Meteorological records from that week show that the weather on the Flannan Isles was actually relatively calm until the 16th. Even more striking is that Superintendent Muirhead's original report makes no mention of these emotional descriptions. Many historians now believe these log entries were invented years later by a pulp fiction writer named Wilfred Wilson Gibson. So, if the men weren't huddled in prayer against a supernatural storm, what were they doing? Let's stay with what's certain. The last official entry in the real logbook was simply a record of the barometric pressure and the state of the light. No tears, no prayers, just the cold, hard data of the job. But if the log wasn't the key, we have to look at the physical damage to the island itself. When Superintendent Muirhead arrived to investigate, he headed straight for the West Landing, and what he found there was staggering. At 110 feet above sea level, a supply crate had been smashed to splinters. Even more shocking, a set of iron railings, bolted deep into the rock, had been twisted and bent like garden wire. A block of concrete weighing over a ton had been displaced from its foundation. This wasn't the work of men. It was the work of the ocean. What's usually overlooked here is the sheer scale of that force. To reach that height and exert that much pressure, a wave would have to be colossal. But this leads us to a difficult question. Keepers were strictly forbidden from going down to the landings during heavy weather. They knew the risks better than anyone. So, why were all three of them out there? If the regulations were followed, at least one man should have stayed in the lighthouse to keep watch. Instead, the tower was empty. The question remains, what was so urgent that it drew three seasoned professionals into the teeth of a monster? The official conclusion from the Northern Lighthouse Board was simple. The men were swept away by a freak or rogue wave while attempting to secure gear at the West Landing. Modern oceanography gives this theory some weight. We now know about the Three Sisters, a rare phenomenon where three massive waves combine into a single towering wall of water. Imagine the scene. Ducat and Marshall are at the landing, struggling with the supply ropes as the sea begins to churn. Suddenly, a wave of impossible height crests over the cliff. MacArthur, watching from the gallery, sees his comrades in peril. In a moment of pure instinct, he runs out to help them, forgetting his oilskins in the rush. He reaches the landing just as the second or third wave strikes. In an instant, all three are gone. It's a logical, tragic explanation. But does it fit the evidence? Critics point out that the missing oilskins don't match this timeline. If the weather was bad enough to warrant securing gear, they would have already been wearing their gear. And yet, one coat remained inside. This suggests that the emergency might not have been a wave at all, but something else that bypassed their training. Let's weigh another possibility, the human element. Some theorists suggest that the isolation of Eilean Mor finally broke the men. Donald MacArthur was known to be a man of short temper. Could a simple argument over a game of cards or a chore have escalated into violence? In this version of events, a fight breaks out near the cliff edge. One man falls, and in the panicked attempt to save him, or perhaps to hide the evidence, the others are lost to the sea. It's a dark theory, but it lacks any physical evidence of a struggle inside the living quarters. Another idea is that one man suffered a psychological break and jumped, and the others died trying to rescue him from the surf. However, we must remember who these men were. They were vetted, tested, and experienced. To suggest a total breakdown of discipline requires a level of speculation that the documents simply don't support. The archivist's rule is to look at what's documented, and the documents show a lighthouse that was perfectly maintained until the very end. This brings us back to the environment. Was there a phenomenon we're still not fully understanding? There is a final, fascinating possibility that combines geography with tragedy. The west landing of Eilean Mor is situated above a deep, narrow sea cave known as a geo. During certain tidal conditions, a large wave entering this cave can compress the air inside, creating a massive upward pressure, a blowhole effect on a titanic scale. This could explain how water reached such incredible heights without a traditional storm being present. If the keepers were near the edge, a sudden, explosive burst of water from the geo could have swept them off their feet before they even saw the wave coming. It would be a silent, invisible killer. Let's compare the two leading theories, a rogue wave sequence versus a localized geographic accident. The rogue wave explains the bent iron, but the geo effect explains why the men might have been caught off guard during a period of relatively calm weather. So, which was it? Was it a freak of the open ocean or a hidden trap built into the rock itself? The archives remain silent on the final answer. The light on Eilean Mor was automated in 1971. Today, no keepers walk the gallery, no one listens to the wind or watches the barometers. The three men, Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur, were never found. Their names are recorded in the annals of the Northern Lighthouse Board, but their fate belongs to the sea. We're left with a locked door, a stopped clock, and a twisted railing. What's usually overlooked is that the mystery endures not because we lack theories, but because the theories we have are all just slightly out of reach of the truth. We can weigh the rogue wave against the psychological breakdown, but without a witness, We are simply guessing at the shadows. The Flannan Isles remain a reminder that even in our era of steel and science, there are places where the world doesn't follow our rules. But then again, perhaps the silence of the island is the most honest answer we'll ever get. What do you believe happened on that rock? Was it a tragedy of nature, or something the archives haven't told us yet? Thank you for joining me in the archives today. The story of the Flannan Isles is a haunting one, a puzzle with pieces that simply won't fit together. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden layers of history, please subscribe and hit the bell icon. There are many more stories waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, stay skeptical and keep looking for what's certain. I'm the archivist,